Okay, so here's video number 2 on for loops. And, I think when I first learned about for loops, I just felt like they were just strange. And I'm going to go ahead and say that as a way for you to feel maybe less intimidated by them, because I do want to pop the bubble of anxiety around some of the strangeness around the coding that we're learning. But a for loop is going to become very familiar to you. It is such a powerful and ubiquitous piece of programming in, I would say, basically every single program I write. I use multiple for loops and sometimes put 2, I think even on occasions 3 for loops nested into each other. They can get really complicated really fast. Even the most basic one, I think, just takes a little bit to understand it, but it is such an important part of anything you're going to be doing with touch-based kinds of interactive media. So you really want to own it. You want to understand this thing. All right, let's take a look at what I have here. This is my entire program right here. And when I run it, you can already see what was run. It prints the values 0 through 11 to the console. If I change this number 12 to 5, it'll print the value 0 through 4. If I put 1000 in there, it will print all the way up to 999. So a for loop, as you can imagine, what it does is it loops through and does whatever is inside of its curly braces until it's done looping. How does it know at what number to start and at what number to stop? And that is a lot of what is going on in here. So let's go ahead and break this down. A for loop is basically divided among 3 separate statements. It's like a super condensed little software program all on its own. So I'm going to try to make this a little bit more readable for the purposes of learning. This is the exact same thing that we just ran. It's just indented and broken out in such a way that makes it a little bit more readable. In fact, I'll go ahead and do that. So a for loop basically has 3 statements inside of it. And as you saw initially, those 3 statements are written one after another on the same line inside the parentheses, but here I've broken them out into separate lines so you can actually read them. The first line creates a variable and assigns a starting number to it for the looping. So it's not uncommon to start with 0 because that's the very first number computers like to count with. So, and typically you're going to use integers for the counting. There's no reason to use float values or other types of numeric data types. So I create a variable called counter. It's data typed as an integer, and I assign it a starting value. And that value in this case is 0. And then let's jump to this third line here. Plus plus at the end of counter is a shorthand way of writing counter equals counter plus 1. It's just a shorthand way of writing fewer keystrokes to say the same thing. Most every programming language has those kinds of operators in it. So the first line of the 3 in the for loop, I assign a variable, and I assign a value to an integer variable. And in the third line of the for loop, I'm going to count up by 1 each time the loop loops. So what is the middle one here? This middle line is, think of it like what would go inside of an if statement. It is what will go inside the parentheses of an if conditional. As long as whatever this second line, this highlighted line says is true, then you're going to keep looping what's inside the curly braces. So initially counter equals 0, and 0 is smaller than 10. So it's going to do this stuff in the curly braces, and then it's going to count up by 1. Now counter equals 1. Well, 1 is still smaller than 10, so it's going to do this stuff inside the curly braces and then add 1. 2 is still smaller than 10. And it's going to keep working in that kind of a fashion until it gets up to the number 10. 10 is not smaller than 10. 9 is the last number that is true in this context. But 10 isn't, and that's why 10 is not listed here. So what the for loop does is it executes code inside of its curly braces as many times as it counts up to the top of a range of numbers that you have assigned within those opening and closing parentheses. So I start with 0, and it counts by 1 so long as counter is less than 10. Let me complicate this just a little bit, okay? I could have the counter start at 5, and then it's only going to count 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I could have it count from 7, and then it's only going to give me 7, 8, and 9. And I could count from 0, but I could count by 2s. And then it's only going to give me 0, 2, 4, 6, and 8. It won't give me 9, and obviously won't give me 1, 3, 5, and 7. So it's a basic way to loop, but there's a lot of really interesting ways to make it more complicated as you design a project that requires a kind of idiosyncratic approach to iterating through the values contained within it. Now, if it isn't obvious in the third video, I'm going to put together what we learned about arrays with the for loop, because the two go hand in hand like they were just designed for each other. Okay, so if you think about an array, it is structured numerically from 0 up to whatever the last row or draw is in that chest of drawers. And if you want to loop through all of the rows in an array, you can do that, and oftentimes do, with a for loop. So before I sign off on this video number 2, let's take a look at this for loop again, because this is more often how it's written. You have the word for, and then you have opening and closing parentheses, and inside those parentheses you have 3 statements. You initialize a variable, you count it up at whatever velocity you've picked, and you have a conditional statement, an implied if condition. And so long as whatever this is true, it will continue to execute what's inside these curly braces. So counter begins with a value of 0. 0 is smaller than 10, so it runs this code, and then it adds 1. Again and again and again, until counter is no longer smaller than 10. That's the for loop.